Hello, lovely folks. So I wanted to make a video for you guys as we sit in the center of the churning obfuscation that is eclipse season to talk about eclipses generally through the specificity of last year's total solar eclipse in Aries. So run your memories back to April of last year, and I'm sure you will be able to find memories of the absolute saturation of conversations about that eclipse. Right. And I want to talk about this in the middle of eclipse season, not talking about the, Pisces eclipse that we just had or the Virgo eclipse that we are going to have as a sneaky way of talking about my absolute favorite thing to talk about in astrology, which is how do we think about time? Right. We tend to sort of live in a metastasizing immediacy of the present. Right. And I especially feel for astrologers who, astrology was always a ninth house pursuit, and as we sort of practice astrology now, everyone feels beholden to the sort of marketplace of social media, which often means people have to get on and sort of sell astrology through these like amplified expressions of the present, right? Astrology in that way can sometimes be this like, okay, everything is about now, this lunation and this full moon and this transit and this eclipse as it's happening in that moment. You know, there's a rapidity and an emphasis on the present that can sometimes trump maybe more complex ways that we would think about time, right? We know, right, that every celestial event is not going to fully reveal itself in a day, right? But that is a lot of the ways that astrology has to sort of like quote unquote stay relevant in the same way that 24-hour news cycles have to kind of create news stories all the time. But when we really dig into the roots of astrology, we see that its timing works actually quite differently than that, right? The temporal sort of spirals of astrology, they all unfold in different cadences and different rhythms, right? Through, some through longer arcs. There are these kind of stages of emergence and ripening, intensification that happen in longer periods of time, right? Very, very few things in astrology, right, sort of arrive whole and complete at once, right? Even a transit, which we might tend to mark by a single date on a calendar, right? You might like have a honeycomb thing and be like, oh, my Saturn transit of my moon is happening today. But we know that it's actually more of a process, right? And we know this not because it's just an astrological truth, but it's also just a very human one. We know that in our lives, right, we don't sort of all of a sudden wake up one morning and suddenly we're married, or suddenly we have a new career, or suddenly there's a newborn baby in our arms, or suddenly some chronic illness has emerged fully formed, right? These are all experiences in a life or moments in a life that are preceded by long periods of preparation and contemplation and becoming, right? Most things are in the process of time, right? And we have to kind of live into those, right? They get shaped by our anticipation, they get shaped by what's happening in the gestation phase, and they get shaped in sort of how they materialize, right? There's a lot of ways that we have to understand time as a process. And if we dig into techniques of astrology, that's even more true. And it's especially true in a lot of the mundane techniques, right? Today, we're going to look at eclipses specifically, but there's a much longer conversation to be had about processes of time and how we think of time in a mundane sense. If you're a member of the Friends of Dorotheus, I just did a lecture, a very casual lecture yesterday on the Jupiter and Saturn cycles as they frame these beautiful arcs of time that unfold in these idealized 960, 240, and 20-year cycles. So, anyways, but for today, we're going to talk about eclipses, right? We know that the timing when it comes to an eclipse is cuckoo, right? We can find so many different moments in the astrological tradition that tell us to conceive of time and eclipses. We're just going to focus on a couple of them today. And we're going to focus on some of the ones that ask us to think about how the eclipse echoes in this kind of longer unfolding of time, long, long, long after the shadow has been cast on the luminary, right? And how the meaning of the eclipse is also going to unfold in those ways as we go, not just day by day, but often year by year. I do want to say, I want to begin this with a very small but very, very crucial disclaimer. My own interest in astrology is as much historical as it is predictive. I love learning about old systems of knowledge. I love sort of like thinking about the ancestors of knowledge, the ancestors of astrology, and how much work they did, how we can time travel and sort of look at their techniques to help us in our contemporary lives understand our lives in a much longer constellation of time, right? And so for me, that's one thing that I want to say. And personally, I find something profoundly enlivening about returning to these methods of our astrological answers. It's why, or ancestors, it's why I'm fascinated by traditional astrology, maybe more so than some of the contemporary astrology. It actually, sometimes looking backwards, gives us a fresh way of thinking about time, sort of the way we imagine the past and the ways that we can imagine a future. Right. So I just want to say that. But I also want to say a lot of these techniques are experimental as they come back into the tradition, right? They're old, but they're just kind of coming back to us. And a lot of things that were old are no longer relevant. We also have to really contend with that. Um, and so I don't know, right? I cannot say, with my full chest that any of these techniques, quote unquote, work, right? I actually don't really trust astrologers who with their whole with their whole chest are like, this technique 100% works, right? We have long been associated with Mercury, and Mercury's job is to change. It's a mutable double-bodied sign that is always asking us to take the next step towards knowledge, right? Even even when we think of that word science as it sits inside our contemporary understanding, right, in those mercurial fields, it really just means knowledge. How do we continue with that mutable movement of Mercury to deepen our understanding of something? So definitely not saying that these, techniques, quote unquote, work. I just really treasure the way that they change my thinking about time. And so I offer them to you also as a way of deepening our relationship to the past, the roots of our tradition, helping us imagine the future of this tradition, and in a really beautiful and expanded way, opening up our conceptions of time. So our topic, right? I want us to go back to that total solar eclipse, April 8th of 2024. It was visible in the United States and it was total. And so if we're looking at a lot of the roots of traditional astrology, and today we're going to spend a lot of time with Ptolemy, second century astrologer Ptolemy and the Tetrabiblos. We're also going to have some other timing things come in, but that's going to be our primary place of entrance into this conversation. But according to Ptolemy and other astrologers, the eclipse being visible and total is an amplification of its impact, right? The more total it is, the more total its impacts are going to be. The more visible it is in an area, the more visible its impacts are going to be. It's actually a really easy one-to-one when it comes to like the thing and then the meaning of the thing. Now, when we look at the eclipse as it occurred in Washington, D.C., um, the total eclipse as it occurred in Washington, D.C. was a Leo rising chart, which makes the sun even more important in the sort of the expressions of the eclipse, given that it was a solar eclipse. The sun is the luminary getting the shadow cast on it, and the sun is also the ascendant ruling planet in that chart. Okay, and why I want to talk about this is that we're inside of a timing window right now where the impacts of that eclipse are active, right? So before we get into that, let's refresh ourselves on that eclipse, right? The specifics of it are definitely worth revisiting. So if you remember, the sun was at 19 degrees of Aries, right? That's where the eclipse happened when we're looking at it through the lens of the United States. We had a Leo rising chart, which puts that 19-degree solar eclipse in the whole sign ninth. 19 degrees of Aries is interesting. It's just the degree past maximum exaltation, right? So we could think of that maximum exaltation degree of the sun, the 19th degree of Aries, which would be 18 to the very, very end of 18 Aries, as this like peak expression of honor and power as expressed by the solar principle. And it was like just as it passed that moment that it was eclipsed. So we can think of this a little bit as this kind of big, bright solar light in that peak exaltation, soma lifted up, then all of a sudden diminished by shadow, right? Right when it's at that very height of its glory. right? And we know that the sun, especially when it's in exaltation, and especially as it connects to eclipses, has long been associated with the lore of leaders, right? We can go all the way back to the Babylonians to get our OG eclipse leader connections, but definitely the sun also contains that connection to leaders, and especially a sun that's like an exalted sun. It's in the ninth place where it's in house joy in the Washington, D.C. chart. So we take all of these together, we can see this as an omen for challenge for anyone who's in a sort of figurehead or solar type role, right? That kind of that bullseye center of leadership as expressed by the image of the sun. Now we can also add into this the specifics of the chart. Like I said, the eclipse fell in the ninth place, which is traditionally associated with laws and courts. As many of you will know, it's often a house that's associated with religion, with universities, with foreign places, etc. So we can sort of say, okay, we're seeing these topics of leadership come in, and somehow the ninth house is also involved. Somehow these topics of courts or religion or foreign places is coming into the mix. Now, we can also look at the ruler of the eclipse, right? Mars in this case, to get a sense of how that's going to play in to the expression of the eclipse. And Mars at the time was in Pisces and was in a close applying conjunction to Saturn in the very tricky and shadowy eighth house. So this adds some real challenge to everything that we just said. We know Mars is a malefic, right? But Mars is also applying to conjoin another malefic, which adds to some difficulty. And then we know that the eighth house can be really tricky, right? One of the primary associations with the eighth house is death and endings, right? We also know that it has a very strong and important connection to financial themes, shared financial themes, markets, all that sort of stuff. So if we are looking at all of this together, we're like tricky, tricky, tricky eclipse for topics of figureheads, leaders, solar type figures, some connection to the ninth house, perhaps in the way that it connects to the realms of courts, to the realms of gods and religions, universities, or to foreigners, and something about the eighth house, either in terms of a financial component or death, right? So taken together is a gnarly and tough little combination. Now, let's talk about timing, right? So if we're thinking about this through the lens of Ptolemy, Ptolemy is going to say, look, the eclipse is not just going to show up on April 8th fully formed, right? In fact, I don't think many astrologers would say sort of the eclipse is going to show up fully formed on April 8th, right? To really, we have to, this is that part where I'm like, dislocate your mind from the like metastasizing present of our like finger drag scrolling now of it all, right? Starting to think about time a little bit differently. Okay. And let's think about how Ptolemy might talk to us about timing. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to give you guys a few more things just to sort of expand how weird looking at all this old stuff is in terms of thinking about impacts. Some of the things that Ptolemy would say we should consider in the eclipse before we get into timing, right? So because Aries is considered one of the four-footed signs, it's a bestial sign associated with animals, sometimes domestic. We get a lot of correspondence with animals. Aries is also one of the northern terrestrial signs, so that connects in Ptolemy's estimation to earthquakes. Aries is an equinoctial sign, so Ptolemy would connect that to sacred rites and to worship, to weather and to crops. And then the Mars, right? If we were looking at this through the lens of Mars being the ruler of the eclipse, Ptolemy would say, well, that connects to wars, to imprisonment, to angry leaders causing death, to fevers, to much death, violence, robbery. In weather, it connects to heat, pestilence, hot winds, lightning and hurricanes, drought, shipwreck, and water drying up. So a lot of different things to consider, but those are all things that while we're swimming in Ptolemy's pool, he would say are potential topics connected to how this eclipse might manifest. So let's look at some of these timing protocols. Like I said, we're going to start with Ptolemy. And so I figured let's start with reading a little bit of Tetrabiblos. This is book 2, the material that is on eclipses. Ptolemy writes, how many equinoctial hours the obscuration of the eclipse lasts in each. For when these data are examined, if it is a solar eclipse, we shall understand that the predicted event lasts as many years as the equinoctial hours which we discover, and if a lunar eclipse, as many months. The nature of the beginnings and of the more important intensifications of the events, however, are deduced from the position of the place of the eclipse relative to the centers. For if the place of the eclipse falls on the eastern horizon, this signifies that the beginning of the predicted event is in the first period of 4 months from the time of the eclipse, and that its important intensifications lie in the first third of the entire period of its duration. If on the midheaven in the second 4 months, and the middle third, if upon the western horizon in the third 4 months, and the final third. The beginnings of the particular abatements and intensifications of the event we deduced from the conjunctions which take place in the meantime, if they occur in the significant regions or the regions in some aspect to them, and also from the outer movements of the planets. If those that affect the predicted event are either rising or setting or stationary or at evening rise, and are at the same time in some aspect to the zodiacal signs that hold the cause. For planets, when they're rising or stationary, produce intensifications in the events, but when setting and under the rays of the sun or advancing at evening, they bring about an abatement. So it's a lot of text. We're going to start with focusing on the instruction on working with equinoctial hours, which are just the hours we're accustomed to for the eclipse. We can see here that Ptolemy says, if it's a solar eclipse, we shall understand that the predicted event lasts as many years as the equinoctial hours. So we say, this is our way of creating an equation where we say, however many hours something is, that is then transferred into a certain allotment of time. For a solar eclipse, that equation is every hour equals a year, and that lunar eclipse equation is every hour equals a month. So let's first start there with our April eclipse. So what we're looking at here is just a screen grab from Time and Date with information as the eclipse as it existed in Washington, D.C. I do want to say that this is, the time will be different if we look at the eclipse in different period or different places. For our purposes, we're going to focus on Washington, D.C., especially because we've created some connections to solar themes of leadership, ninth house topics of law, courts, etc. The institutional mechanics that make government function. So for our purposes, we're narrowing our window and we're just looking at Washington, D.C. And we can see that the duration of the eclipse is 2.5 hours. So if we know our equation is for every hour, we get a year. 2.5 hours would equal 2.5 years, right? So that's our very, very first thing that we want to start off with. So in DC, 2.5 hours equals 2 years and 6 months. So our total timing window is going to be August of 2024 to February of 2027. You might be asking, why am I starting in August? And I will say, because Ptolemy lets us know that we want to find our beginning. And our beginning is calibrated off of the year. If we return to our text, it says, the nature of the beginnings and the more important intensifications of the events are deduced from the position of the place of the eclipse relative to the centers. Right here, we're talking about the axial degrees of the angles. If the eclipse is on the eastern horizon, so closer to the ascendant, the beginning is going to happen in the first period of 4 months of the year. If it's on the midheaven, the second 4 months, and if it's on the descendant, the third 4 months. So we get this inside a year, which Ptolemy is letting us know that the eclipse will begin at some point within the year from its occurrence. That because this eclipse is on the midheaven, it's going to begin in the middle third of the year. So that second 4 month portion of the year. So if we add our dates, we say April plus 4 months gives us August of 2024. So we would say the beginning period starts in the second 4 months of the year, August 8th through December 8th, 2024. We would say somewhere in this period is the beginning of the impacts of the eclipse. And I'm not going to do any interpretation, but I will let each of you, each of your minds wander and call up all certain events that happened in the US between August 2024 and December 8th of 2024. So we say the beginning is here, right? Now, if you noticed, Ptolemy names the intensification period, also calls it the more important intensification. So we can say there's something that's letting us know that Ptolemy is directing us to the intensification period as being quite important. Now, once again, we're going to work in our thirds, but with the intensification, we're working with a third of the total duration. So if we know the total duration of our eclipse is 2.5 years, 1/3 of that is 10 months. So 10 months from the beginning, we know that the beginning is between August 8th and December 8th. The window of the intensification period beginning is June 8th through October 8th. And then if we think about how long that will last, we take our 10-month portion, our second 2/3 of a 2.5-year cycle. We would say that that's somewhere between June 8th, October 8th through April 2026 to August 2026, right? We would say that this is our intensification window, right? Really focusing on this period of time as being the big bullseye center of the eclipse manifestation showing up. Okay, so there are a lot of other things that we could do, even just with Ptolemy's method. We could look at, like rulers of the eclipse. When is Mars having major moments in its synodic cycle? We know that in the intensification window, Mars will have its evening set. It will also have its cazimi, those kinds of things. But I think let's keep it here for now, just as a sort of introduction to opening up the ways that we might think about how astrological timing unfolds. If you enjoyed this, I share this kind of stuff in my Patreon all the time. So if you are not a member, you can always join. Members get discounts. People who are in the paid membership tiers get $50 discounts on readings. There's a student tier that meets every week. That student tier is at recording. We are going to begin a bunch of study of traditional Time Lord systems. We're going to start that in mid-October of 2025. So if you wanted to learn about circumambulations, primary directions, circumambulations, aka distributions, primary directions, perfections, all that good stuff, come and join. There are 3 tiers for easy access. The lowest tier is $20 for folks of low income and low wealth. The mid tier, or the regular price, is $50 a month for the student tier. And then we have a sustainer tier at $90 for folks of higher wealth and higher means who want to support the many folks who are in at the $20 tier. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, let me know. I might do another video looking at some of the other really cool ways that we can work with eclipse timing. There's some really fascinating work with monthly perfections that we can use with eclipses. But for now, let's leave it here. And I send lots of love and ease to you as we sit held in the middle of the churn that is eclipse season. Thanks for listening. Bye.